Welcome to the summer series of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. In today's episode, you will hear from three presenters at our 2024 conference. The first is Dr. Damien Freeman and Senator Dean Smith on recommending an appointment to the Sovereign. The second paper is from Dr. Josh Woodward, A Cure for Prejudice, Robert Menzies' Travel and Nationalism in the 1960s. The third and final paper is from Dr. Michael de Percy on From the Bottom of the Sea to the Moon, Menzies and Australia's Communications Golden Age.
In 1947, when W.J. McKell was appointed as Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia on the advice of J.B. Chifley, R.G. Menzies was the federal leader of the opposition. Menzies criticised the appointment on the basis that the nominee was Australian, a politician, and had no military record. In 1965, Menzies recommended the appointment of Lord Casey as Governor-General. He was Australian and a retired politician, albeit one with a military record. McKell was the second Australian appointed to the office. The first, Sir Isaac Isaacs, had served from 1931. Casey was the first Australian to be nominated by a Conservative Prime Minister. In between McKell and Casey, three Britons served as Governor-General: Sir William Slynn, the first Viscount Dunrossell, and the first Viscount Delisle, on the nomination of Menzies. Since Casey, all nominations have been Australian. Two serving politicians have been nominated, one by a Labor Prime Minister, the other by a Liberal Prime Minister, and not all have had a military record. Menzies has written about his approach to the nomination of a Governor-General and what he understood to be the role of the Sovereign in the appointment process. This paper will discuss the evolution of Menzies' approach to the nomination process and the way that the appointment of Casey did and did not set a precedent for future appointments to the office. And as you heard, I've prepared this with Senator Smith, who has asked me to present the paper initially. So I'll give you a sense of what we've written, and then he'll offer some remarks that can lead into the question and answer afterwards. So the background to this is the development of the Office of the Governor-General, which really happened in three stages, and the appointment process develops in three stages accordingly. First, there's the colonial period, when the governor is basically a minor functionary of the colonial office, and as a result is appointed by the colonial office in the same way as any other ordinary government appointee of the British government. There's nothing special about it. There'd been some attempt to change the process, in particular with the rise of responsible government in the colonies. Colonial governments suggested that they should have some input into the appointment of the governor, given that the government was now accountable to Parliament in the same way as Westminster, but that was ignored by the colonial office. The first major change really happens with federation, when the new office of the Governor-General is seen to be the personal representative of the Sovereign. Initially, the Governor-General is both the personal representative of the Sovereign and the Agent General of the British government. The Governor-General is the channel for communications between the Australian government and the British government. And the Governor-General is originally appointed by the Sovereign on the advice of the British ministers of the Crown. And this is the way from the beginning of Federation. Hughes in 1919 suggested that this should be changed. He sent a proposal that said that Dominion governments should be able to nominate possible appointees. So the advice to appoint the Governor-General would still come from the British ministers, but at least the Australian ministers should be allowed to make suggestions about who they thought would be appropriate. This was rejected by the British, but as a concession, the British said that they would give a choice. So Hughes was given a choice of 3 candidates, and he chose Lord Forster. And from then on, we start to have this sort of understanding that maybe although it's still up to the British ministers to recommend the appointment to the king, they should allow some involvement from the Australian ministers. But the really important change happens in 1926 at the Imperial Conference, when it was agreed that the Governor-General was now to be the personal representative of the sovereign in right of the Dominion. And this is a fundamental change in the understanding of the structure of the British Empire and the beginning of the idea that, in fact, the crown is not one and indivisible anymore, but that there can be separate crowns in each of the dominions, and that the sovereign acts on the advice of the ministers in that dominion, not on the advice of the British ministers in relation to that dominion. So that's the basic important idea that happens. But part of what has to be dealt with in that is, well, who's going to make the recommendations to the king about who he should appoint as Governor-General, and what are the principles that are relevant for that. And that wasn't resolved in 1926 at the Imperial Conference. That was resolved at a following Imperial Conference in 1930, when it was agreed how this should be done. The background to this was that Scullin had been trying to get Sir Isaac Isaacs appointed as the first Australian Governor-General. The appointment occurred in 1931, but it formed a background to the Imperial Conference in 1930, because the British had word that this was the intention, and this was thought to be a radical innovation, that the king could be represented in Australia by an Australian. We now know from archival research that John Waugh undertook that George V was very active at this time in trying to influence the way the appointment would be made and the way the Imperial Conference of 1930 would be understood. And it's now clear that the King and Buckingham Palace thought that this was an opportunity to increase the role of the king in making the appointment of the Governor-General. Up until then, it had been made on the advice of the British ministers, and the king thought that this might be an opportunity for him to be able to make the decision personally, and he would decide who would represent him. That did not happen, and the British basically sided with Scullin and said, no, you have to accept that you're still going to act on advice, but you'll now act on the advice of the Australian ministers. And George V reluctantly accepted the advice to appoint Sir Isaac Isaacs. This was an innovation for a few reasons. He was Australian. He had served in politics, albeit a long time ago, because he'd been Chief Justice of the High Court at that time. And he was not someone personally known to the king. And up until then, it had been understood that the king would appoint someone to represent him who was known socially to the king and who could represent the king in the way that the king would wish to be represented. So Isaacs is appointed, and after his appointment, Lyons then reverts to the custom of British appointees. Lord Gowrie is appointed by George V, and then Curtin recommends the appointment of the king's brother, the Duke of Gloucester. So that takes us to the appointment in 1946 of McKell. And Chifley was the Prime Minister at the time, and Chifley decided he would revert to this idea of appointing an Australian, and he would recommend William McKell, who had been the Premier of New South Wales, who was still the serving Premier of New South Wales and who would step down and become Governor-General. This has been presented by historians as a decisive moment when McKell was committed to the idea that Australia needed to have an Australian Governor-General. That is now, we know, incorrect. It was not his first choice. And again, thanks to John Waugh, we know that he in fact wanted Louis Mountbatten, then the Viscount Mountbatten of Burma, subsequently Earl Mountbatten of Burma. That was his first choice. So a relation of the king. This was not immediately meant to be an Australian, but he decided that he would go with McKell, and then he dug in and he was determined. And again, we know that the king, by this time George VI, was not happy about this and tried to influence it behind the scenes. And Waugh has published the correspondence about this. And in the end, the king accepted that he had to act on advice, and he appointed McKell despite his concerns. Now, at this time, Menzies was the leader of the opposition, and he raised the matter 3 times in Parliament, in the House of Representatives. On the second occasion, or the first time, it was just a rumour and he didn't name the person. The second time, he said explicitly that he understood that the Labor Premier of New South Wales was being rumoured to be appointed. And then the third time was after it had been announced that it would be McKell, and he explains why he thinks this is a bad appointment. And he says, the Governor-General of Australia being the King's direct personal representative, the appointment of somebody notoriously not chosen either by or in effective consultation with him being the King, and whose appointment would, by reason of party political convictions, be distasteful to a large section of Australian citizens, must inevitably weaken the symbolism of the Governor-Generalship and therefore of the Crown which it represents. So he's objecting to the idea that an Australian politician will be appointed. He's careful, though, to say that his objection isn't merely that he's Australian, because Isaacs has already been appointed, so he knows he's lost that battle, and he knows that there's now a precedent for Australians. But he says the big problem here is that the appointee is someone who's been actively involved in Australian politics. And it's apparent that the King himself was concerned about this, and was concerned that someone who'd been directly involved in Australian politics wouldn't be impartial in the way that the sovereign's representative should be. And he says in the House of Representatives, the notion that a Governor-General or a governor is that the direct personal representative of the King would obviously be falsified. The prestige of the office, which depends upon subtle and intangible matters, including a deep emotional response in the hearts of the citizens, would inevitably decline. And we see Menzies arguing in 2 ways here. He talks about the sorts of personal qualities that are important, and he talks about the importance of the imperial link. He says an intelligent understanding of the importance of the crown as the symbol of empire unity requires that the nominee or nominees of ministers should be able, by reason of character, attainments, temperament, and experience, to act in Australia with that detachment, impartiality in great constitutional issues, and dignity which inhere in the Crown in the government of the United Kingdom. And I think to the modern reader, his discussion of personal qualities resonates and seems like something we would still think is very relevant. His preoccupation with imperial unity just seems to us now like something from another world, and doesn't seem remotely like a relevant consideration. So that's the second time he talks about it in Parliament. The third time he talks about it is in the context of a motion of want of confidence in the government. He levels a number of charges against the government, including that they have constantly practiced political jobbery in public appointments. And he says the worst example of this is the appointment of McKell as Governor General. And he says it's a mistake to appoint someone who's been directly involved in Australian politics, but worse than that, he says, McKell participated in a caucus vote on his successor after it had been announced that he was going to be the Governor-General. And he says, at least McKell could have avoided the worst of this if he would have immediately withdrawn from any political activity. And he says, this shows that he still regards himself as a Labor man, and he's not demonstrating the sort of impartiality that's required by the office. Chifley responded to Menzies and he said, Mr. McKell will bring to the position a ripe experience of affairs and a knowledge of administration in Australia. He will bring with him also a full appreciation of the aspirations and ideals of the Australian people. I think this last sentence is really important. The idea that he will be a good Governor-General because he will bring a full appreciation of the aspirations and ideals of the Australian people. And I think when Senator Smith offers his remarks, he might say something about the way that has continued to be something that has been seen as being important in recommending a nomination for Governor-General. John Ewer, in an article about this, notes that after McKell's time, when it fell to Menzies to appoint someone, he says, Menzies seized on the opportunity to appoint a person with more obvious support for the political order held dear by Menzies and his party. A person who exemplified all the qualities of the Liberal version of non-partisanship so valued in the Menzies era. And I think this contrast between the Chifley position and the Menzies position is relevant because this is still a tension, I think, in how Prime Ministers have recommended appointments as Governor-General. And it goes to something I think that Ewer identifies, that there are, as early as the time of Chifley and Menzies, competing ideas of non-partisanship. What does it mean to be non-partisan or impartial? And it's clear that there are two different ideas going on, and everybody agrees that the Governor-General should be non-partisan or impartial, but from Chifley onwards, the Labor idea of what that means seems to be more connected with something like a full appreciation of the aspirations and ideals of Australian people, and the Menzies idea has something much more to do with detachment, and so we see this, I think, go on. So Menzies then has his opportunity to appoint a Governor-General, or rather to recommend the appointment. He has the opportunity on 4 occasions, and we know something about his approach from the account he gives in his memoirs, Afternoon Light. And he talks about the first time he had to recommend an appointment in 1952 when he was in London on other business, and he raised the matter with the Queen. And I think it's probably well known to people, the famous account he gives here. He says to the Queen, well, it's not for me to tell you who you have to appoint. We need to discuss the possibilities. And he says, so what we'll do is you'll write down 3 names in order of preference. I'll write down 3 names in order of preference. And I happen to be going to see the Marquess of Salisbury at the weekend, so we'll ask him to write down 3 names as well, and then we'll compare them. And the story goes that when they opened the 3 envelopes, each of them had as their first preference Slim, and that's how we end up with the recommendation of Slim as the next Governor-General. And Menzies is clear that he says this happens in 2 parts. There's to be informal consultation, which was the comparing of the lists, and then after that, he would offer his formal advice. The Queen could participate actively in the first part, the informal consultation, but when it came to the formal advice, she would act on the advice of the Prime Minister, and that's all there was to it. And he gives a rather florid account of this in Afternoon Light, which I think some scholars have perhaps misrepresented or misunderstood the tone of what was going on there, which perhaps has something more to do with his idea of courtly behaviour and the way that it was appropriate to speak to the Queen. Anyhow, he also tells us that what his view of the 1930 resolution of the Imperial Conference was. He rejects Scullin's approach, and he's very clear. He says, the only change that happened was that we had a move from the British ministers making recommendations to the Australian ministers making recommendations. He says it was always the case that we needed to keep this, we had to have an informal consultation, but the time for that would remain. And Scullin rejected that and said, no, I just tell you and that's it. So how much of this survives now? How much of Menzies' approach is still with us? To some extent, the principles that Menzies tells us are still there. It's still the case that the sovereign acts on the advice of the Prime Minister. It's no longer the case that there's this informal discussion. It's quite clear from the statement Scott Morrison gave that that's not the case. It's still the case, I think, that impartiality matters, although, as I flagged, it's still a disagreement about what impartiality means, and it's clearly no longer the case that it's thought to be important that there should be a personal understanding, a personal knowledge on the sovereign's part before the person's appointed. I've been told I've run out of time, so I'll stop, and the Senator can maybe say something, and then we can have some questions.
Well, thank you very much to Damien for that. Just by context, I thought I would share with you that I'm an avowed constitutional monarchist. But what interests me is how constitutional monarchy in Australia has some defining characteristics that are not shared with other similar nations like Canada and New Zealand. And what I was particularly interested in with this exercise is how the evolution of thinking around constitutional monarchy and the appointment process in particular has sustained it rather than eroded it. And I think that's for me, that's a really important point when understanding Menzies' contribution to institutions that I would regard as central to our democratic success. And my attention to this was enlivened, particularly the conversation around what impartiality might mean for the interpretation of impartiality for a Labor appointment compared to impartiality for a Liberal appointment. And of course, most recently, we had the decision to appoint Samantha Mostyn. And what struck me as being consistent with the Labor interpretation of impartiality were the words that the Prime Minister used, echoing Chifley's comments about full appreciation of the aspiration and identity of the Australian people. When he described Samantha Mostyn, he talked about Samantha Mostyn as being an exceptional leader who represents the best of modern Australia. He characterised her as a modern and optimistic leader. But what struck me as more significant was listening to Samantha Mostyn's contributions in the Senate when she was sworn in as Governor-General. And I don't have an answer or an explanation for this, just an observation. Much of her effort in her contribution, both in the Senate chamber being formally sworn in, but also at the reception that happened just outside the Senate chamber, was her great emphasis to highlight her connection to military. Drew attention to her father's 40-year service as an officer in the military and his Vietnam service. Drew attention to the fact that her sister had married into the Australian Army. recounted the story of the history of the 21-gun salute and its association with the emptying of the guns when ships would enter ports. So much so that she recognised the Federation Guard prior to the Welcome to Country contribution that she... And this struck me as very curious, because there can be no doubt about Samantha Mostyn fulfilling that Chifley, now Prime Minister Albanese, view about representing aspirationally a certain vision for our country. But the great personal effort that she went to in drawing an association and a connection with the military. And I thought that was powerful, though I don't have an explanation for it. But going back to Menzies, and in Afternoon Light, we read this particularly, that he was not opposed to change. He recognised that change would be inevitable. And so for myself, when I look at issues like this, but also other discussions around Menzies' legacy, it's the evolution of his positions that I think sustains, for me, an understanding and appreciation, a durability of his ideas, not that they were fixed. And so working with Damien on this particular project, I was sort of greatly reassured that my thinking about Menzies was, enlivened and emboldened by understanding this particular topic as well. So I thought I would just share those remarks, not to give you any answers necessarily, but to highlight to you, why I've enjoyed working with Damien on this, and why I've got every confidence that constitutional monarchy will evolve, but will be a mainstay of our democratic features for many, many years to come. Thank you.
A quick disclaimer, I'll be reading some passages from Menzies' speeches. I won't be attempting an impression. It was a cool morning in March 1964 when 600 delegates representing the tourism industries of 23 Pacific nations arrived at Sydney's chic new Menzies Hotel. Attending for the 13th Pacific Area Travel Association Conference, representatives from the United States, Japan, New Zealand, China, the Philippines, and numerous Pacific islands slowly filled the lobby. What a modern hotel they were in, we can see. Double glazed windows, at the time the tallest window units in Australia, stretched from the first floor lounge to the function room on the floor above. Opened the year before, the 300-room hotel boasted that it had been constructed from the wonder materials of the decade, precast concrete cladding, and bronze anodized aluminium, and probably asbestos. Opened the year before, the dark bronze plating that decorated the walls and fittings gave the lower floors where the delegates were busy gathering and registering an aura of novel elegance that the hotel's owners proudly claimed was unknown in the architecture of its competitors. The Menzies Hotel claim to modernity was also gastronomical. It was the only hotel in the country where a guest could order crepe Suzette at 3 a.m. Selected by the host organisation, the Australian National Travel Association, to showcase the first-class accommodation available in Australia, the Menzies was a fitting hotel for the convening of an industry that saw itself at the cutting edge of international advertising and public relations. Named after a famed 19th century hotelier, it was also a fitting coincidence that the Menzies shared its name with the conference's much-anticipated keynote speaker. After tea and coffee, guided by the bronze gilding of the central staircase's black timber handrails, the delegates ventured from the lobby to the second floor function room. From darkened seating arranged under banners bearing the names of PATA's member countries, Philippines, Tahiti, Republic of China, and so on, the gaze of the audience was directed by way of light and sound towards an illuminated centre podium. There stood at 9:30 a.m., according to Menzies' office diary, The Prime Minister, arriving not long after congratulating his wife Pat on the morning of her 65th birthday. The address that Menzies delivered remains surprisingly overlooked both in Australian tourism history and in accounts of the Menzies years. In the speech, he contended that in the modern age of the 1960s, travel had a role to play in eliminating the spiteful antipathy between nations that had so scourged the 20th century. Menzies, by 1964, had formed a view that travel offered nations a powerful means of overcoming difference. Travel, he said, promised to foster peaceful international relations, avert war, and secure lasting peace. This paper, situates Menzies' address at Pata amongst other travel-themed public statements he made on tourism in the 1960s. I aim to explain the political and intellectual ideas underpinning his conviction that travel broadened the mind and invigorated the human spirit. I explore how Menzies' long-formed idealistic outlook, what Greg Melhuish, and Stephen Chikura refer to as his philosophic idealism. How did this philosophic idealism contribute to Menzies' travel-themed optimism? I argue further that there were additional paradigms responsible for his arrival at the conclusion that tourism was an important facilitator of foreign relations. The degree to which Menzies discerned travel's progressive capacity from his own travel experience, both within and outside of Australia, has also received scant attention. Similarly, little is known about Menzies' close association with the ANTA, the Australian National Travel Association, which dated back to Menzies' formative years in Melbourne in the late 1920s. This paper aims to fill some of these gaps. So, what did Menzies say when he took to the podium? His speech underlined the idea that travel was not only economically beneficial, but also that it had a higher purpose, helping individuals from different nations find common ground and understanding. It was not the scenery that a tourist should set out to see, he said, arguing, primarily it is the people, what they are like, and what they do. We are all different people. Many of us speak English of a kind, and many of us do not. But the differences of language tend to fall away a little, and people do get to know each other. Menzies said that nothing could be more remarkable than the impact of moving around for a few days or a few weeks among other people, sensing the atmosphere of a place, getting an impression of what the people there are really like, and above all, discovering that they are all human beings. He believed that travel instituted better relations between individuals of different nationalities, therefore harmonising relations between nations. A brief visit to another country could reveal this shared humanity. It could offer a cure for the animosities that had plagued the first half of the 20th century. In Menzies' words, this century of ours has been disfigured by prejudice and hatred more than any other century, far exceeding in these things the worst period of the Middle Ages. There is no cure for prejudice half as good as getting to know the person or race or community about which you have been prejudiced. Menzies' experience of and ideas about travel are relatively under-examined. Historians often interpret Menzies' diaries of overseas travel as representative of his closed-mindedness and allegiance to British culture. Judith Brett. In The Forgotten People concludes that Menzies was singularly lacking in curiosity about other people and other cultures and other ways of life. Writing on his first significant overseas travel in 1935, Brett argues that this journey awakened in Menzies no excitement about the variety of experience. Rather, everything he saw merely confirmed his belief in the superiority of the English. Unfortunately, it's outside the scope of this chapter to revisit the pre-war travel diaries, and I don't want to jump the gun on a future submission for the Institute. But this characterisation of Menzies as uninterested in testing and expanding his views seems out of step with his rhetoric at the Pata Conference in 1964. So what explains these opposing visions of Menzies? Was he a frozen Edwardian, as some critics have charged, or did his liberal philosophy affirm an open-minded approach to the world? I think, of course, an important caveat is that Menzies' outlook wasn't perhaps as fixed across time as we tend to think it is. He was also disposed in his public speaking to make kind of romantic expatiations of humanistic optimism. His philosophic idealism, a belief that the central forces driving history were intellectual and spiritual in nature, was clearly in full swing when he penned his words for Patter's delegates. Perhaps after celebrating his wife's birthday, his confidence in mankind was running a little high. I suspect this was not the case. His rhetoric in 1964 suggests a broader, more idealistic view of the world than he is probably remembered as having. The relationship between travel and Menzies' belief in a common humanity was an extension of his liberal philosophy, which above all things elevated the autonomy of individuals. A strain of British cultural idealism or cultural puritanism that had taken root in 1920s Melbourne was key to Menzies' philosophical development. Those shaped by this cultural and intellectual movement emphasised the moral and spiritual advancement of humanity as central to progress. In Menzies, this atmosphere of spiritual idealism animated convictions that would become the pillars of his local but also global outlook. Imperial allegiance, limited government, individual freedom, the fostering of a national spirit, foreign relations, all of Menzies' views on these big questions were somehow touched by that Melbourne idealism, much of which is evident in the passages that I've cited from his 1964 speech. His idealism on travel did have economic dimensions. In one section of the speech, he spoke on a hypothetical visit of Australians to Japan and of Japanese to Australia. He said, when somebody from Japan comes over here to buy wool, or somebody from Australia goes to Japan to buy textiles, what they are doing is dealing with one facet of a whole complex of economic cooperation. Both would think it silly, though, he pointed out, to be told that they are extending these boundaries. One would say, practically, I am here to buy wool. The other would say, I am here to buy textiles. Nevertheless, said Menzies, because of this exchange, they contribute to a two-way trade that facilitated trust, broke down barriers, and diminished the chance of future conflict. Not coincidental was the invocation of relations with a former adversary, whose delegates now sat before Menzies, engaged in the very two-way trade he described. Herein lay the importance of tourism to world affairs. As Menzies passionately declared, this trade, which I shall call the tourist trade, is of tremendous importance as a remover of sources of international friction. His rhetoric resembled more than just a hope for economic cooperation. The speech indicates that his views on tourism aligned with his liberal ethos about citizenship and national unity. He had long argued that individual responsibility and engagement were key to building a strong nation. In earlier speeches to smaller tourism conferences, for instance, Menzies framed travel as an important element of citizenship, suggesting that travel formed a contract between ordinary citizens of different nations. His experience of travelling within Australia also informed his optimism about travel. In the 1964 address, he recalled that when he was a child, interstate travel was rare. States remained isolated from each other. He said that when he was a small boy, it was considered a phenomenal thing for anybody to travel interstate. We were parochial, he lamented. He added, today, with all the facilities of transport, with all the revolution that has gone on, assuming we can pay the fare, we have no excuse for not travelling. Advancements in transportation and the comparative affordability of travel increasingly empowered people to take holidays. In Australia, Menzies suggested greater access to travel had united the states and reduced parochialism. Australia's experience, he believed, could be replicated on a global scale. In Menzies' words, the average man and woman today is immeasurably better able to pay for some travel than their grandparents ever thought. Thousands and thousands of people coming in and thousands of people going out, all engaged, whether they realise it or not, in this ameliorative work in relation to our contacts with other countries. This revolution in travel was in large part facilitated by the National Travel Association, the organisation hosting the conference at which he was speaking. I hope to shed some light on Menzies' association with ANTA. Founded in 1929, ANTA was concerned with improving Australia's reputation overseas. Menzies' connection with ANTA dates back to the 1920s, during the early days of his legal and political career in Melbourne. Like many Victorians of the day, he admired Harold Clapp, the visionary leader of the Victorian Railways and the first chairman of ANTA. There is a distinct similarity in the rhetoric of Clapp and Menzies when it comes to travel. Clapp said in 1929, for example, that travel is not only an educator, it is a preserver of peace. As we have seen, this is a sentiment that Menzies' vision shared. Though Menzies compelled Clapp to oversee wartime aircraft production and railway gauge standardisation, little remains known about their personal relationship. An obituary wrote for the public servant in 1952 suggests a closer acquaintance between the two Victorians than has fully been explored to date. Menzies wrote that he had the singular good fortune to know Harold Clapp closely and to be in a position to estimate the value of his work. Their relationship dated back before Menzies entered Victoria Parliament. Menzies eulogised that it was his privilege to be, to some extent, his legal counsel and later to be his unofficial advisor on problems which went beyond the boundaries of the law. I kind of like this idea of Menzies as a fixer in 1920s railway Victoria. Menzies recalled that as Minister for Railways, he enjoyed the pleasure of constant association with Clapp in his administrative work. So this organisation that Clapp was a key part of, their stated mission was to overcome state parochialism and foster kind of national pride and project a positive image of Australia overseas. Anta's campaigns aimed to encourage Australians to travel within their own country, thereby strengthening national unity, much as Menzies' political rhetoric emphasised the importance of citizenship and collective national identity. Anta was itself a product of the 1920s idealism that so shaped Menzies. Like the man that would become the nation's longest-serving Prime Minister, the Travel Association also enjoyed widespread popularity with mainstream Australians. It was through the lens of Menzies' Melbourne-formed idealism that he intuited travel's civilising influence as a force for peace. In its spiritual aspect, travel promised to foster understanding, build relationships, and reduce the prejudice that divide nations and people. In this sense, travel went beyond the material experience of commercial tourism. It was a mechanism for the engendering of greater relations locally, but also nationally and globally. Menzies said to the delegates, "This travel you are encouraging is, I believe, one of the most civilising influences in the modern world." For Menzies, travel in the modern world did not mean luxuriating in the modern amenities of places like the hotel where he spoke. Travel served a deeper purpose than flambéed crepes at 3 a.m. At a time when the fatal consequences of war were still keenly felt, the notion that travel broadened the mind reduced the hopeful thought that modern nations could keep at bay the destruction and slaughter heralded by multinational conflict. Travel's enduring capacity to broaden the mind and bring people together remains as true today as it did in the 1960s. Indeed, many tourism campaigns still reach for this message today, even if the resonance is dimmed by the crowded marketplace of modern tourist advertising. For Menzies, though, it was the individual spirit, unhindered by the borders imposed by states, that promised to advance the cause of peace. Relations between nations began with individual people, free to explore the world at their pleasure. In the Forgotten People address, Menzies declared that if the new world is to be a world of men, we must not be pallid and bloodless ghosts, but a community. His 1964 address at Pata gives expression to how he imagined the formation of such a community could occur. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm coming to you live from Madrid. And as Zach said, I'm talking about telecommunications. And in this particular case, from the bottom of the sea to the moon, Menzies and Australia's communications golden age. Now, I'm a political scientist, not a historian, but my PhD was actually about telecommunications, a comparison of communications policy from the time of the telegraph to broadband. So it was really interesting to engage at a very sort of personal level with Menzies and his involvement in what I would call the golden age of Australia's telecommunications. So what I want to do is I'll just start with my main sort of premise or what I'm focusing on. There are a few different issues that I could focus on. One of the types of technologies and how that was sort of brought about. And the other is the sort of leadership of Menzies in doing that. But it's really interesting that Menzies is elusive in terms of a leadership style when it comes to his embracing of science and technology more generally. And in my previous presentation in the chapter in the current issue or volume, it was the same thing. Menzies was very much about enabling nuclear to occur, as opposed to being one of the main drivers. And we find that too in telecommunications. And hopefully by the end of this, I'll have explained that sufficiently. So my main argument in looking at this golden age is that Menzies was an enabler of science and technology, and that he was open to new technologies. But what's really interesting is he was always self-deprecating about his scientific knowledge. And in almost all of the photos when he's dealing with telecoms or satellites or nuclear or any of these sort of major advancements in science and technology, he made claims that he basically knew nothing, that he was leaving it to all of the scientists to go ahead and do what the magic that they did. And in many of the photos, he's also making fun of himself. So it's really interesting that he ironically used this self-deprecating sense of humor in relation to science and technology. But his opponents, particularly his future opponents, have actually used that self-deprecation and weaponized it to make out that he was an old fogey who wasn't interested in science and technology. So there's a fair bit of sort of irony there. And I'll talk about some of those issues as well. But one of the things that we notice most about Menzies is that he was able to change when he was presented with new facts. So and we can see this in a number of different policy issues. If you look before the Second World War, for example, he was very much on the side of appeasement, as many others were. Then after the war, he was anti-appeasement. He saw that it didn't work. And so a lot of this sort of policy learning, and obviously he's been criticised for some of these things, but in general, he's demonstrated that he was able to actually change his view on things when he was presented with new facts. And it's quite interesting at the moment, looking at our own energy policy, where we're not seeing that occur in the industry. But again, in this particular chapter, I don't intend looking too much at the present and sort of recasting history in that way. But I just make the point that when we look at Menzies in this particular golden age era, he was very open to new technologies, very much a promoter of science and technology, and he did this through various ways. So these characteristics of Menzies, in my view, facilitated Australia's communications golden age. So when we look at Menzies' critics, it's interesting that, as I said, that they actually use some of his own attempts at humour and weaponize those against him. So to Menzies, to his critics, Menzies was a pompous, anachronistic, forelock-tugging establishment figure who held back the tide of Australia's potential and denied the country its independent greatness. And it's interesting that this quote is actually from a journalist who had this view, but then went and sort of relearnt their history of this particular period, because this was the sort of 1980s and beyond story that they'd been told. And they actually went back and rediscovered that their own view that had been sort of given to them through their education of the 1980s and beyond was actually quite incorrect. But again, Paul Keating said of this period that it was the golden age when Australia was injected with a near lethal dose of old fogeyism by the Conservative parties, when they put the country into neutral and where we gently ground to a halt in the nowhere land of the early 1980s. So we have this this idea of a golden age that we can actually see in terms of submarine cables, coaxial cables between the three major capitals, delivering subscriber dialing and international phone calls and all these sorts of things. Yet we have Menzies' opponents saying that he basically did nothing and we ground to a halt in terms of technology. And again, when we look at the actual technologies, and it's not just not just telecommunications, but also nuclear and all forms of science and science promotion, we find that nothing could actually be further from the truth. Now, this photo is interesting. This is actually a photo of Menzies applauding himself while making his own policy speech on TV in 1960. So Menzies merely endured television, and he was very much the orator, and he really enjoyed radio as a medium. But when television came out, he wasn't a great fan of using the medium, even though he appreciated that it was a medium for the future. So he actually played this major role in a golden age and established the scientific capabilities for Australia, or enabled these scientific capabilities that have actually endured beyond his tenure. So we have this sort of enduring the new technologies, but then also enabling them to continue on. And this photo, as I said, so this was actually the first time that Menzies had used television to deliver a policy speech. And as you can see, sitting at home watching himself, and you can tell from the photo that he's actually quite chuffed about his performance. So there's a few things, though, that predate the golden age. And again, this is something that Menzies is not given credit for. Menzies actually launched Australia Calling, which later became Radio Australia. And he did this in 1939. And it was a multilingual service using shortwave radio to counter disinformation during the Second World War. So shortwave radio, it's an old-fashioned term. It is effectively high frequency, or HF frequency, but it kind of overlaps different measures because of the thing of the time. But in effect, it's a form of radio that bounces off the ionosphere and enables almost global communication when the atmospheric conditions are right. And so from 1939 onwards, Australia actually started delivering news services and anti-propaganda. In some ways, you could argue its own propaganda, and beamed it into Asia in particular as a way to counter the propaganda that was occurring from Japan and Germany and Australia's enemies. And I don't think many people appreciate the extent that this new capability with shortwave radio actually impacted disinformation. And here we are now in modern telecommunications dealing with exactly the same things and looking at ways to counter them. But the ways that we're trying to counter them are not really about providing alternative information, but they're about trying to lock down those systems. So again, it's a very different approach that Menzies took. Now, of course, Menzies didn't drive this. He wasn't necessarily a driver of it, but he certainly embraced the technology and used this and incorporated this into his sort of policy approach more generally. Now, I'll come to this a little bit later. Probably one of the key things is Menzies' tenure began in a really interesting period in Australian history, and it followed the Chifley government. And of course, the Chifley government had picked up after the death of Curtin. And so we see this period in the post-Second World War era where there are lots of things happening, and lots of things that are happening are the fallout between Australia and the UK. At the same time, Australia is still working with the UK for defence and for new technologies, including telecommunications and also energy, but at the same time embracing a new relationship with the United States. It's interesting that one of the quotes I read from MacArthur said that basically MacArthur viewed Australia as a place for the United States to launch its attacks from. It wasn't necessarily about being in Australia to defend Australia. Now, I'm not sure where that sort of rabbit hole leads just yet, but it's interesting that many of us, including myself, would view the United States of having lost tens of thousands of lives of their soldiers defending Australia. Whether or not that was necessarily about protecting Australia as opposed to protecting the US's own interests is probably immaterial. It's a simple fact that that had occurred. But what I think we don't really appreciate about this telecommunications golden age in particular is how technology transfer actually occurred between Australia and the United States. Now, we saw both the Chifley government was interested in this as well. Now, obviously, when Menzies took over, things changed and became the situation was much more ripe in order to take on these new technologies. But I just want to give you a couple of other examples of this golden age. So the first is Menzies launching the Trans-Tasman link of the compact cable. And the compact was basically the Commonwealth Pacific submarine cable system. And this occurred in 1962. And basically the cable landed at Bondi in Sydney, and it connected New Zealand and Australia. The entire cable network connected the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So Queen Elizabeth II officially opened compact in 1963. And of course, using the cable, she was able to do this simultaneously, addressing London, Ottawa, Sydney, and Wellington. So this really represents a major step forward. And the reason it's a major step forward is because previously wireless telegraphy existed. So we could have these communications, but these communications were conducted using Morse code. And we didn't have the voice-to-voice capability that the compact cable enabled. There's also the CCOM cable. CCOM connected Australia through Hong Kong. It landed at Cairns, and there was a microwave link from Cairns to Sydney. And microwave is one of those technologies in telecommunications that was given a really bad rap, particularly by Paul Keating in his tenure. But a lot of it was political. But look, even my own broadband network in regional Australia runs on a microwave link. So it's interesting that these technologies were available in Menzies' time, and they're still being used today to deliver high-speed broadband. And this is a use that wasn't foreseen at the time. It was simply for voice and faxes and other sorts of things. So another interesting thing too is that it's quite serendipitous. There's a lot of serendipity in the Menzies era, and one of those is the 1956 Olympic Games that were held in Melbourne. So this was a sort of major driver to get the three major capitals, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Canberra, I guess, connected in through this coaxial cable. Now, we might sort of see this as like, oh well, it wasn't Menzies, it was the Olympic Games required it, so it happened. But it's interesting that when we had the Commonwealth Games in Brisbane, we didn't have the same sort of embracing of the technology. So there's something about Menzies and his abilities or capabilities as an enabler that made sure that these things happen, as opposed to what we saw with NBN in Brisbane, where it was simply just not happening, not being delivered in time because it wasn't being given the priority. So there's elements of prioritization of science and technology that sort of forms part of this golden age that stems from Menzies. So another major element, and this is so we're just talking about from the compact being under the sea and now to the moon, and effectively Menzies officially opened the Tidbinbilla Deep Space Tracking Station along with NASA officials who visited in 1965. And this is a photo of him walking near the satellite, just near Canberra. Now, the interesting thing is that Chifley's government had actually organised a good deal of this in 1946, as they'd done with nuclear as well. But again, I don't think we appreciate at least from the available history, how important Menzies as an enabler was when it comes to the actual technology transfer. So just because the Labor government had engaged with the US and was interested in receiving the technology, that didn't necessarily translate into the technology being delivered. And we saw this, of course, with nuclear, and that was the same with the British as well. So there are a few other things that are worth mentioning when it comes to Menzies, and I want to talk just now about the enabling issues. So acknowledging the groundwork established by the Chifley government and the contemporaneous drivers for the 1956 Olympic Games, Menzies really was the keystone. He kept everything together. So there's a number of sort of side stories, and one is about Percy Spender and ANZUS. So the ANZUS Treaty was really the sort of enabling document that enabled technology transfer to occur, and it demonstrated Australia's commitment. So one of the reasons Australia committed to the Korean War, and it was the first country to side with the Americans in the UN force. And in my own visits to Korea, I've spent a fair bit of time conducting research along the DMZ in Korea. And there are people, local people, who still acknowledge Australia's input into their own defence. So it's important on a personal level for many Koreans, but it was also very important strategically in terms of Australia's relationship with the United States. Now, Percy Spender obviously spent a good deal of time organising this. Some argue that he was the architect of ANZUS. It's interesting in the memoirs, particularly the letters and other memoirs of Sir Robert, that he didn't seem to be a big fan of Percy Spender. And I know a lot of it has been written about this, and obviously I'd like to explore this more in terms of Menzies as an enabler. But in effect, without Menzies enabling these things to have happened, I don't think it would have brought everything together. Hence my idea of Menzies as a keystone and holding it all together. Now, Richard Casey earned the moniker Rocket Man, and this was to do with him embracing satellites. And it's really interesting. I see parallels between Richard Casey and Tony Staley in his role in bringing about OSAT and other advancements later on as well. And again, here we have coalition members who, according to the opposition narrative, were old fogies and not interested in new technologies. But the majority of these telecommunications technologies driven in Australia, particularly in the post-war era, have come about from the coalition, and a lot of that owes its foundations to Menzies' legacy. So it's interesting too that the Australian Academy of Science actually acknowledges Sir Robert's leadership and how this led to substantial advances in science and technology in Australia. And they mention things like telecommunications, like ANSTO, like the CSIRO, and also like the Australian National University. Now, again, there are all of these legacies from the Chifley government that are involved in that lead up, but it's really Menzies who cements them and brings about practical outcomes from these arrangements. And some of the other things to consider too are scholarships and even the Colombo Plan. These enabled education to occur in Australia. And there's a lot of debate about Whitlam bringing in free education. But it was Menzies who brought about scholarships that were based on merit, and the scholarships were also means tested. So this, in effect, enabled the best and the brightest of our students to attend university. Now, obviously, it wasn't universal, but at the same time, he was involved in encouraging or enabling people to achieve levels of education that previously they couldn't unless they were members of the elite. And I think that this role of Menzies in education and embracing science and technology is undervalued in the contemporary sort of view of his impact. Now, also, it's important to realise that Menzies' role in mediating between the UK and the US in Woomera, and also the involvement of the weapons testing, this actually led to Australia being able to launch its own satellite from Woomera, and I think it was the fourth country in the world to be able to do so. So for a very small country at the end of the earth, these were some magnificent achievements in terms of space technology, and a lot of this is because of the conditions that were established by Sir Robert. I think also it's understated how the impact of ANZUS, or the impact that ANZUS had on the relationship between Australia and the UK. The UK were particularly upset. Churchill, in particular, was upset that Menzies went ahead with this with the US and didn't have the UK involved. Now, obviously, with AUKUS in present times, things have changed a bit. But it's interesting again that Menzies was sort of called an Anglophile who was British to his bootstraps, and that again these criticisms that he wasn't interested in changing with the times, and it's just simply not true. I mean, he actually actively embraced collaboration with the US, and again, if you look at his period in retirement, he spent a good time in the United States. And again, he was able to change his mind, at first thinking that the US was a very different beast than the Anglo culture that he was sort of used to in the empire. But over time, he came to appreciate the culture and developed friendships and other relationships that became really important in Australia, in the US, and particularly in enabling that transfer of satellite technology to Australia. Now, look, I've only mentioned a few of the technologies. There are other satellite systems that were established. Obviously, Parkes had been established. Parkes had been established before the war. It played a major role in later on, after Menzies had retired, but in particular in the Apollo 13 rescue. Obviously, the Apollo 11 mission, Australia's satellite network, was perfect in terms of location, that enabled the US to function here. Menzies made sure that it wasn't just Australia, the Australian public paying for these satellite services as well. His idea was that at least 50% should come from the private sector. And my understanding too is that it was the Rockefeller Institute and another, sorry, the name escapes me at the moment, but it's two American philanthropic organizations matched Australia dollar for dollar, and the US even put in extra. And Menzies makes a comment at one stage that even though we agreed dollar for dollar, I know for a fact that the US has put in much more than we agreed. And he was sort of trying to skirt around that. And again, making a joke about it as if he'd done the dodgy on the US. And I just found that fascinating, that sense of humor that he has. It really isn't captured in the historic, the way that the history of Menzies had been taught previously, at least. So, and finally, Menzies' role in shaping technology transfer across communications and nuclear, a lot of this comes down to not only leadership, but the enabling relationships and the diplomacy that he was able to use. And I think too, again, just referring back to Spender and Casey, obviously they were very capable. They played very important roles, but at the same time they were part of Menzies' team. So Menzies was able to give them the freedom to pursue what they wanted to pursue, but at the same time he was able to bring that into his government's overall approach. And now, obviously, in terms of the major benefits of the satellite network, these really occurred after Menzies' tenure, particularly with the moon landing. But it was a really important part of Australia's commitment to its strategic alliance with the United States. And the other thing that made it very worthwhile, and this is something that Menzies was always conscious of, was he was always conscious of the workforces that were available that had sufficient education to support these emerging industries. And this even goes into the mining sector. When he was looking at uranium, he didn't want uranium miners moving away from the coal sector. He wanted these things to develop organically and appropriately, as opposed to just sort of a free for all. And it's really interesting when we look at NBN and other more recent major infrastructure builds that we've had in Australia. We've seen the biggest problem has been the lack of a workforce to support the grand visions. So Menzies was very capable in terms of managing skills, obviously not through his own portfolio, but certainly through his government and bringing everything together. So in many ways, he was the conductor of this golden age, as opposed to the person who knew everything about the technologies. So in effect, what I'm trying to say is that the portrayal of Menzies and the coalition since as anti-science and anti-future for political gain denies his rightful place in Australia's technological advancement. And so that's what I'm hoping to be able to do. And like I said, I'll be focusing on the idea of Menzies as the keystone that held it all together, that enabled this golden age. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.